Well, hello again, everybody. This is John Norris at Trading Perspectives. As always, we have our good friend Sam Clement. Sam, say hello.
John, how are you doing?
Sam, I'm doing fantastically. All the more so because today's Halloween.
It is Halloween.
It's Halloween.
Sneaks up on you.
You know, I'm dressed up as a guy in his mid-50s, works at a financial services company. That's how I'm dressed up today.
It's a great costume.
Yeah. So hey, listen, I resemble that.
Perfected it.
You got your little girl dressed up for tonight?
She will be a piglet tonight.
That's awesome.
You can do that at under a year old.
Well, I think when Annie was your daughter's age, we dressed her up as a pea in a pod or something like that. Photo ops with grandparents, and then back at the house. That's pretty much what's going to be. In any event, today I wanted to talk about something a little bit different, a lot less fun than talking about babies and Halloween costumes. And that is just something I've noticed on my X feed, which I don't go to very much any longer because I was blocked years ago for saying something about Bernie Sanders' ability to understand Econ 101. They still haven't unblocked me for that. But what I've noticed on threads and other message boards and what have you is all this talk about living wages, and it's important for living wages, living wage this, living wage that, minimum wages, and how companies should bite the bullet and just pay their employees more, and just all this just talk about just paying workers more. And the more I read it, the more I'm thinking to myself, this sounds like people's hearts are in the right place, but it also sounds like perhaps maybe people don't understand the way the world actually works.
Well, I think that's the tough thing with a lot of economic issues. I mean, in general, everyone, paint with a broad brush here, but in general, everyone has the same kind of large goals. I mean, we want people to be able to have a job where they're able to afford a decent quality of life at least. I mean, who's disagreeing with that, right? But the problem is when you start getting into economics, a big part of what you learn in studying it is unintended consequences.
Yes.
And that's where things make the issue tougher, especially when we're dealing with a country that is so big, so vast, and so different all throughout it. Makes a conversation about minimum wage tougher.
It makes a conversation about minimum wage tougher. Living wage is just a nebulous term and concept. I have a difficult time wrapping my brain around it. I think I know what people are meaning, but at the same time, sort of along the lines of what you're alluding to with a minimum wage of one size fits all for a country and economy our size is a fool's errand. I mean, it's the minimum. You could have a minimum wage of $20 in the Bay Area, and you know what?
Probably not doing a whole lot.
Probably not doing anything. You're probably setting the floor for labor below the clearing price for it. So that really doesn't matter. However, you put the minimum wage at $20 an hour in, say, Dallas County, Alabama, which is where Selma is, and everyone's going to be out of a job.
Yeah, it's as confusing as the minimum wage conversation can be as a country. The economic principle of it is pretty simple.
Yes.
It's if you're setting the floor too high, that's going to cause a lot of pain.
Yes.
And if you're setting the price too low, which would be the Bay Area in this example, it's not doing anything. Which is frankly how it's already been in most areas. The minimum wage is already, that floor is already too low.
I mean, if you were to take it, the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25,
hasn't been adjusted.
You know, something you could probably go on there if you really wanted to go to the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, or the Census Bureau, and really dive down into the data, trying to find a number of American workers that are working full-time, 35 to 40 hours a week, trying to make a go of it at $7.25 an hour. The number is going to be in the hundreds.
Mm-hmm.
Hundreds.
Yeah.
Not hundreds of thousands. I mean, it's just not there. But going back to the minimum wage, talking about raising it, you know, one of the things that you remember at the beginning of the year, I think it's out in California. I know it's out in California. They raised the minimum wage for fast food workers to $20 an hour. There's been scant evidence that this has led to a huge spike in loss of jobs. Mm-hmm. And that's fine. I mean, that doesn't mean you raise the minimum wage. It doesn't mean if a bunch of people are, all of a sudden you're going to have, a huge number of job losses in that particular sector. But what it does mean is the configuration of the labor force changes. back a couple years ago when California actually increased its minimum wage throughout the entire state. At the end of 2022, the unemployment rate for 16 to 19-year-olds was around 11.3%, Sam. And when they increased it to 15.5 from something like 11 or 12 bucks an hour, you saw the unemployment rate for 16 to 19-year-olds start to shoot up. And then when all of a sudden at the beginning of the year, not all of a sudden, I say that way too much. Then at the beginning of the year, they increased the minimum wage to 20 bucks an hour for fast food restaurants, which you intuitively think might have a lot of 16 to 19-year-olds. That unemployment rate for 16 to 19-year-olds in California is like 22+%.
Yeah.
And so, but when you take a look at the number of fast food jobs in aggregate in the state, there hasn't been a ton of job loss. However, the people that would have historically have taken them are out of work. You have a surplus of workers. That's what happens when you set the floor for labor above the clearing price for it. You just have a surplus of workers willing to work at that particular job. So instead of 16 to 19-year-olds filling in, after 3 o'clock or whenever they can, get off work after practice, or college students working part-time, those people are now squeezed out. People that were making 15, 16 bucks an hour in other sectors are now putting frozen potatoes and french fries.
And if the fast food workers, in an example, were making $10 an hour, and you're already making 15 to 20, that's where you're comfortable with, and now everything or a lot more jobs are above in that 15 to 20, you have a lot more options there. You have a lot more. So that complexity is not only just states and cities.
Yeah.
It's sectors. It's age demographics. I mean, all these things change and push people out or into different parts of the labor force. And that's what makes it tricky. Yeah.
Well, I mean, going to that labor making 15, 16 bucks an hour, let's say threading bolts and screws. You're making 15, 16 bucks an hour there, doing that type of stuff. Not a lot of fun, complete repetition. But then there's also possibility for bodily harm. And there is. Whenever you work in a machine shop, that's what you're going to find. So when the government says, okay, now you can go make actually a little bit more money frying burgers or working the drive-through, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what's happening. That's what happens with the minimum wage. You really are setting the floor for labor. You set it above, as Sam alluded to, the clearing price for labor. You're just going to have more people looking for work at that particular wage. If you set it below the clearing price for labor, it's worthless. It's meaningless. And I would tell you, I think when you take a look at California, take a look at other states that have increased their minimum wage, and then you have economists from the state universities say, hey, we're not really seeing any significant job losses or what have you. You have to take that with a grain of salt. It's incomplete data. It's data that they're not willing to show, because if you were to go to the Bay Area, you probably haven't seen a whole bunch of fast food jobs lost. Mm-hmm. However, if you go to Calexico, down there on the border with Mexico, at that wage, probably seeing a lot of fast food workers out of work, or a lot of McDonald's closing, if you catch my drift. And so that's what, when you see that, it's kind of frustrating to me, because when you are raising minimum wages, when you're talking about living wages and putting them at a level that's above the clearing price for labor, it might be well-intentioned, but what you're really doing is harming those employees that you want to help, because sometimes, and it might sound like evil in people's ears, it's sometimes, and with some workers, their comparative advantage in the workforce is their ability or willingness to work cheaper than someone else.
Yep. And, this may not be the perfect example, but we've seen good ways for wages to go up, right? I mean, locally, we've seen it when companies like Amazon come in and need literally thousands of workers, and they are competing. That's an area where they compete, and that helps drive wages up. I mean, the post-COVID, we've talked about this plenty of times, the difficulty for restaurants to hire workers, and we've seen wages go up because people just demanded higher wages. Yes. There was a strong enough economy to where the labor force was in high demand. When you're in high demand, you're going to get paid more wages higher wages.
I mean, you bring up Amazon. That's a great case in point. Here in western Jefferson County, in a former industrial city called Bessemer, Alabama, they have a distribution center, and at one point, I think it was the distribution center for Birmingham metropolitan area, which is about 1.2 million people. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, they have now put up another one on the eastern side of the county. But in Bessemer, when they opened that thing up, I think they were paying $15 an hour. Mm-hmm. That's what I remember. Minimum wage here in our state's the mandated federal one at $7.25, and Bessemer, that whole area of our county's disadvantaged. Some of the poorer sections of Jefferson County, and Alabama's a poor state. You got some poor. So when Amazon comes in paying $15 an hour, this might be hard for people listening in Los Angeles, but $15 an hour was a great job, or is a great job in western Jefferson County, Alabama. Mm-hmm. People are happy to have it.
Yeah.
And so, but take a look at if you're in SeaTac or Seattle or some other such places where $15 an hour gives you, a shotgun shack without any hot water.
That's $2,400 a month.
Yeah, I mean, so when you take a look at that, believe it or not, that's a living wage. That's actually a bump. That's a raise for people in that section. So when the union came in, you remember that?
I do.
The union came in trying to beef up the wages and what have you. The people in West Jefferson County shot it down because, and I remember seeing some interviews saying, I don't want anything to screw with a good opportunity.
Right.
And so when my job here, I was making $10 before, now I'm making 15. I don't want to mess with that.
They came in, they needed a ton of workers, and they had to compete for talent. And the two ways that this is not just an Amazon thing. I mean, we see this with large companies that need large amounts of people, whether it's a Chipotle, Starbucks, Chick-fil-A, Amazon. These companies have to compete for labor, and the two ways they largely do it, one are wages. That's the easier-ish one. The second one is opportunities for advancement. And so it seems to me the best way to, if you're just forcing companies to pay higher wages, they're not really competing for workers. They're not going out and saying, hey, we have to compete with these others for these employees. We need to offer better career advancement opportunities. You get none of that.
No.
The way to do it is to, and again, COVID's not necessarily the best example, but it was a period where labor was in high demand, and you forced companies to compete and offer better opportunities for labor.
Who can argue with that? Or I'm sure that plenty of people would argue with you on that, but people that probably don't have a degree in economics like you do. In talking about all this, I keep on going back to things that I've seen on social media in the past, and it's hard to tell who's a real person having these kind of comments and what's a bot. It truly is. There's so much of this out there on my thread that either Instagram has got some very bad algorithms about what I want to see, or they just know it's just going to cause me to have a stroke reading some of this stuff. Now, a few years ago, I remember I was reading, I forget which social media platform, some guy, some virtue signal out there, really was, he just patted himself on the back for being such a magnanimous guy, talking about how he had been a bookseller for years, and he'd always had his, he'd been in business for 20 years, and he prided himself on being able to pay his employees a living wage. Well, and then he also commented, I had to shut down my business a few years ago due to someone else. The problem was with someone else. Someone else was screwing him. All that type of thing. I'm going, man, you just are kind of contradicting yourself. You're paying your workers some nebulous living wage when you can't control your revenue. The way the businesses work, or you have to, it's revenue and expenses. That's it. Mm-hmm. Revenue, expenses, and the bottom line profit is what's incenting you to keep going. We can make it more complicated than that. Yeah. However, with, say, like a bookseller, you've got two costs. Cost of goods sold. You got the cost of the books that you have to sell, cost of revenue, and then you have your SG&A, what you're paying your employees, marketing, and what have you. Since you can't control the revenue. You can't control people coming in and buying your books. And the cost of the books from the publishers are what they are. Mm-hmm. The only real lever that you can pull to ensure that you stay in business is your SG&A. Mm-hmm. How much you pay your employees and other marketing, what have you. So if you were out there mandating that businesses who can't control their top line increase their big lever and don't have the ability to move that lever. It can only move in one direction. It's anathema to profitability, which ultimately is going to be anathema for economic activity, because if there's no incentive to make a profit, or it becomes more difficult to turn a profit, why would anyone out there go into business or open one up? If all of a sudden, let's say, say they come across Washington and says, hey, unconscionable profitability. You should only make 4%. That's what you should pay. You should pay living wages to everyone. Minimum wage, $30 an hour, whatever it is. I'm going to say that this is all you can generate. Why would anyone go into business when if I'm maxed out at 4% or something like that? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go take my cash and go get 4.6% in the Treasury bill. I mean, seriously. Or I'm going to take my money, or what's left of it, and go buy the SPY, exchange traded fund.
We've seen this in other countries. That example you're giving is it diminishes the reason to take risk.
Yes.
And we've seen that in other countries. I mean, Japan's kind of, to me, the shining example for that. When there is not a lot of incentive to go out and take risk, people won't do it.
Yeah.
And economies don't grow. And you mentioned this top versus bottom line thing. Needing to grow the top, you have to grow the top line for things to work out.
Well, yeah, without a doubt.
Especially if these costs are going to grow, and this isn't unique to companies with minimum wage. It's the conversation around the U.S. debt. I mean, everything. Nothing works long term. These artificial bumps in the cost don't fix problems. The only way to get all this to work, to get employees to start making that living wage, whatever that actually is.
That's a nebulous term.
Is through growth. I mean, we've seen this in these periods of strong economic growth without intervention from the government, at least in wages. Mm-hmm. That's where we see real wage growth. I mean, we've seen unemployment rate in the 3s recently. Mm-hmm. We've seen real wage growth on the bottom quintiles because of that. I mean, it's the only way to have long-term sustainable impact on wages. Positive long-term impact.
I mean, I think you're right.
And I just don't get how that's really debatable.
Well, listen, apparently
it's like
it
these
is.
Short-term stopgaps with unintended consequences happens anytime you let the government step in and mandate something. It's either going to do nothing or cause consequences.
Well, let's go back to that stat that I seemed to pull out of the ether earlier regarding the unemployment rate for 16 to 19-year-olds in California. This after they've jacked up the statewide minimum wage and then the minimum wage for fast food workers. When all of a sudden those people that want to have a job, those 16 to 19-year-olds, and they're stopped from having the ability to do so, or a huge chunk of them, what they don't get is that experience and, believe it or not, whatever marginal job skills they have, which will end up benefiting them in the future, you're keeping those people from actually developing in the workforce by mandating a wage that is above the clearing price for their labor.
Yeah, and there's a part that some people I think don't like to hear, or may sound harsh, but there are certain jobs that are not meant to be careers.
Yes.
And again, the government stepping into those
and making it a possibility. I mean, I would, if you were to ask Ray Kroc whether or not he thought that one person putting frozen potatoes and boiling grease would be able to support a family of 4 off of what they were paying per hour, he probably would have said no. No, that's not what we're intending here.
And so this artificial bump up, if that becomes, hey, this can be a long-term kind of thing.
At $20 an hour, I mean, might be.
This can become a long-term thing for me.
Yeah.
then there's no economic growth, and then because of that, there's no advancement opportunities. Again, going back to my example of when companies have to compete significantly for labor, that's where opportunities for advancement come from. I mean, we've seen Starbucks is a great example. They have tons and tons of employees.
Yes.
Their big focus now to compete, because they are competing with a ton of companies.
Yes.
Is opportunities for advancement.
Yes.
It's free college if you work here long enough.
Same thing with Chick-fil-A.
None of that happens if you artificially force higher wages.
Yes. I mean, the thing is, and that's
because you have nothing to compete over anymore.
Well, listen. I mean, that's what happens. And if someone were to come in and mandate significantly higher minimum wages, or I've used the word nebulous for living wages, and I'll explain myself in just a second. When you increase, or by law, by edict, what a person gets paid in terms of salary or hourly wage, whether you realize it or not. I mean, your heart can go out to these people. Those businesses that have to pay that higher hourly wage are just going to make up that cost saving someplace else, or that cost someplace else.
Two ways.
I mean, it's going to be, hey, you know what? We used to have the silver plan, for the health insurance. We're going to bronze. Or we used to have a 4% match. Now we have a 2% match, or no match at all.
Or hey, we have 5 people typically working the store right now.
Yeah.
We're gonna stretch it to 3 of y'all, and you're just gonna have to work harder. Or we're raising prices.
Because that's the way businesses work. At the beginning of the year, businesses will come out and say, this is about how much we need to earn this year. And believe it or not, for people out there thinking the billionaires are bad and corporate America sucks and all that stuff, what is the average net profit margin for companies in the S&P 500? 11%?
Something like that. I mean, then you have
12%?
Plenty of them in the low single digits.
I mean, Walmart's 2. Grocery stores are
1,
2
2,
or
3.
So when you take a look at it, if you were to ask the average person on the street and say, hey, you're a business owner, and, what kind of rate of return would you want to see? People probably go, well, I don't know, 15%, 20%, I'd as much as I possibly can. And that's themselves. I mean, so when you take a look at, that's what corporate America is making, anywhere from 10 to 15%. That's probably not as much as people out there yelling about the greed of corporate America. That's probably not what they think. What they're really thinking is the fistful. I mean, fistful. You can write it down on 2 sides of a piece of legal paper. The number of publicly paid CEOs that get really, frankly, kind of an unconscionable amount of money. And they extrapolate that throughout the entire economy, and it's completely unfair. Because the best business owners are not out to screw their employees. Because you know why? Because they want to ensure that they have as productive a workforce as they possibly can. Because productive workers will generate more output, which is ultimately going to drive the bottom line.
Pretty easy.
Now, before we go, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the reason why I say the term living wage is nebulous, is because it means different things to different people. Mm-hmm. It's fine to sit there and say, I know it when I see it. However, when you're demanding something as vague as that, and you're forcing companies to pay up, you better come up with a better definition of I know it when I see it, or a family of 4, all that type of thing. What you need to do is quantify that. I think everyone would say, roof over their head, clothes on their back, food to eat. I think everyone would agree that that's basic standards. However, 2 cars, is that part of a living wage? Vacation to the beach, hey, that sounds fantastic. Is that part of a living wage? 4 cell phones? Satellite TV? I mean, what's a living wage?
What is it?
What is it? If you can't define it, don't ask me to pay for it. I guess that's the best way that I can kind of describe it, and why I've called it nebulous. Now, guys, today we have talked about something that is getting a lot of press as we lead up to the very 11th hour on the election, and just taking a look at everything I see out there on social media, just like, I've got to get this off my chest somewhere. And Sam's got to get it off his chest, or I told Sam he needed to get it off his chest here this morning. And so that's the reason why we chose to talk about this. Be careful of people that talk about jacking up minimum wages. Be careful of people talking about jacking or just calling out living wages, all that stuff. All that stuff is great, but there are economic consequences to everything. Because businesses and even nonprofits are in the business of making money. And anything which is anathema to that will have unintended and undesirable consequences. It's just as sure as the nose in my face and as sure as the sun will come up in the east tomorrow. Now with that, guys, thank you all so much for listening. We always love to hear from you all. So if you have any comments or questions, please by all means let us know. You can always reach us at tradingperspectives@oakworth.com, or you can leave us a review on the podcast outlet of your choice. If you're interested in reading more or hearing more of what we got to say or how we think, you can always go to oakworth.com, OAKWORTH.com. Take a look underneath the Thought Leadership tab and find access to all kinds of exciting information. It's scot-free, by the way. Find access to all kinds of exciting information, including links to previous Trading Perspectives podcasts, links to our newsletter slash blog, Common Sense, links to our quarterly analysis and magazine, Macro and Market, and the fine stuff that our advisory services group, led by Mac Frazier. All that stuff is out there as well. So with that, Sam, got anything else you want to talk about this very exciting topic?
That's all I've got.
That's all I've got today, too. Y'all take care.